Hello and welcome to the Creative Financing Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Gallegos, here with.
Jeff Rappaport.
And today, guys, we're doing kind of a conference call. And on this episode, we're going to talk about when to use the various strategies for creative financing. So, Jeff, you want to talk about that a little bit? I know you get a lot of questions on when you should use what. So we wanted to make an episode on that. When you should use a lease option versus contract for deed versus all-inclusive, so on and so forth, right?
Correct. And I think that for some people, this will be a total review, which isn't a bad thing. But for some others, I think they're getting confused about some of the differences and what they actually mean. And some of them are interchangeable where you could use, it's kind of up to you, but you need to know what the potential consequences are of using one strategy over another. So I thought this would be a good time. We haven't covered this for probably like a year, and it'll be a good review for some, and for others, it'll be hopefully very helpful in terms of what kind of strategies to look at.
Okay. So I guess let's just start with the 5, right?
Well, let's talk about, let's kind of group them because we're dealing with people all over the country. Some of the terminology we use may not actually apply to them. But it does, but it doesn't, because there's just different terminology. So let's kind of group them. That way people can get a little better idea of how they all work.
Okay.
So we have what's called the lease option. Okay, lease option is pretty straightforward. It's a rent with the option to buy. So you actually have a lease. The seller stays on title. Seller maintains all the tax benefits. Ownership. What the tenant buyer gets is control of the property, so to speak, and with the option of buying at a certain price within a certain amount of time.
Okay.
Lease options are great. I don't love them when you try to stay in the middle, what we refer to as a sandwich lease option. I think that there's some issues, and there are ways around it, so don't get me wrong. And if you want more information about sandwich lease options, there's 2 people that I think are super, they focus on this kind of stuff, and that would be Joe McCall and John Jackson. So if you're interested in creating sandwich lease options particularly, those are the 2 that I would recommend you look up and see what they have to offer.
Right.
Lease options are great. In my opinion, that the best time to use them is when you have acquired a property. You are now the owner, whether you've gotten conventional financing, whether you've gotten owner financing, whether it's subject to, or it doesn't even matter. As long as you own the property, you now can rent the property with the option to buy. And one of the key things that I like about it, 2 things. One is that instead of getting a security deposit, you're going to get an option deposit, and it's going to be considerably more than a security deposit. And that money is non-refundable. You get to keep it no matter what happens. That money gets applied toward the purchase price if and when that tenant buyer buys. The second thing that I really like is that I've always given all of the responsibility of the maintenance and repairs, all the utility costs, everything, to the tenant buyer. I usually give them like a 60-day window. So for the first 60 days, while they're getting used to the property and figuring out what works, what may not work, that at that point, when 60 days comes, they're now responsible for everything. And so if the furnace goes out, that's their issue. The roof starts leaking, it's now their issue. Those are the real benefits of the lease option. And it's a pretty easy sell to the seller because in reality, all they're doing is renting their property with the possibility that you may purchase somewhere down the line.
Right.
Okay.
It's pretty straightforward. I mean, lease options are pretty easy to understand. They're simple and they've been around for a very long time.
Yeah, and most people understand them. I think really where the concern is that at least for me, when you try to stay in the middle, yes, you can put a notice of interest or I can't remember what it's called, the memorandum of something on title to kind of cloud the title. That way you're not getting cut out of the deal, but there are some issues for you to get paid at the end. It's not an issue up front. You can get your monthly cash flow. It's getting the equity at the end that is a little messy, and you either have to deal with the seller or you've got to deal with a lender, and I don't love it. That wouldn't be what I would do.
Yeah. And the reason for that is just because you're not the owner on title. So that's kind of one of the drawbacks is when you're not the owner on title.
Nowhere on title.
Yeah, exactly. You're not on title. So, I mean, you're trying to get paid in the middle between the buyer that you lined up and the seller. And so, I don't know how you would just maybe escrow or bill the escrow company or do a title invoice. I'm not sure what.
Yeah, there are some issues, and sometimes you've got to go back to the seller and work something out, in which case you'd probably be letting the seller know how much money you're going to make, which I don't love. Sometimes it's a little messy because when the lender is doing the loan, again, you're nowhere on title. And somehow you've got to get not on title, but you've got to get on the HUD where your payment, your equity is coming to you, and it's not that simple. It's doable. Don't get me wrong, it's doable. I know people that do it all over the country. I just don't like it. It's a little messy. I'd rather do the same thing, but use owner financing, doing it even if I'm not on title, as I would be like a land contract or contract for deed.
Right.
There's still you are still going to be in that what is the term that I'm looking for? That you're going to be in that chain of title. That's what I'm looking for. Chain of title.
Yeah. And if you're not in the chain of title, again, like the only thing I can think of is like kind of the way a listing agent gets paid on a property is that fee is on the HUD, right? It's on the settlement statement, and the escrow company pulls that off. So that you would have to get on that HUD somehow. And you can do that by invoicing title for the difference. Or, I mean, it could even be set up as finder's fee, something like that.
Yeah, to me, it's like, think about this, and and then we'll cut this off because I don't really want to talk about lease options a whole lot here. But if let's say that your tenant buyer is ready to buy, and your seller says, prices have really gone up. I'm really selling this property well under market value, and I don't know if I really want to do this anymore, and tries to back out. Going to have a difficult time backing out with the tenant buyer, but where are you? How are you protected? Yes, I know you've clouded the title and you can make it so that the purchase doesn't actually occur, but now you've got to still try to get yourself paid. And if you have a decent amount of money coming, if you had $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 coming to you, it's very possible you're going to have to chat with the seller about how you're going to get that money and how it's all going to work. And if that seller is already not very happy that they're selling their property for way under market value at this point in time, and then they find out that you're making a significant amount of money, could be an issue.
Yeah, and you can't really force them to sell the property, and you would have to take them to court at least to make them try to perform on that contract or on that lease option. But I mean, that's where it could really get ugly if it went that route.
I love lease options when you are the owner. I love lease options to wholesale. I just don't love lease options to stay in the middle.
Right.
And again, if you're looking for more information, I gave you two good people that you can check into.
Yep. Cool. All right, moving on. So that kind of segues right into another strategy we use called contract for deed. You want to talk about that?
Not yet. So what I want to do is kind of start at the beginning, and let's talk about the most basic type of strategy. And this is called either a trust deed and note or a mortgage. And really the only difference between the two is depending on what state you are working in. Some states are mortgage states. Some states are trust deed and note states. They are basically the same thing. They secure a debt against a property, just like a bank that's making a loan. They would get a mortgage or a trust deed and note. The trust deed secures their interest in the property. The note outlines how they get paid for whatever they've agreed to with the buyer,
right,
or lender or borrower. Sorry. So they work exactly the same. The only difference really is what state that you're dealing in. And so you have trust deed and note states and you have mortgage states. When we're going to use that trust deed and note or mortgage is when the property is free and clear. And we are going to create a new note to the seller, and the seller is literally going to finance us. And just like the bank would, exactly the same way. And title is going to transfer to the buyer. The buyer is now going, if you looked it up on the county recorder of that particular county, you would see yourself or your entity or your trust or whatever the case may be as the new owner of that property. And if you dug deeper, you would see a trust deed and note or a mortgage back to the seller. Is that clear?
Yeah.
That's the most elementary part of financing. I mean, This is what you're dealing with when you go deal with a bank. It's the same exact thing that you're dealing with, except with the seller.
Right.
When free and clear, when there's no debt owed against the property, or any debt is going to be extinguished prior to closing or at closing.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now let's talk about the next, which is when we're creating a note and there is underlying debt on the property, and we're going to leave that underlying debt in place. There's basically three different types of strategies that you would use. One is called an all-inclusive trust deed and note. That would be for all the trust deed and note states, where we're basically creating a new note that's going to wrap around the existing note. Along those same lines, we have what's called a wraparound mortgage. That's for all the mortgage states. And same thing, we're creating a loan that wraps around the existing debt.
Right.
Okay. And then the third one would be subject to the mortgage, which is, in essence, the seller is deeding you the property, and you are now the owner of the property along with the debt that's already on it. The debt remains in the seller's name. The seller is responsible for that debt. If that debt does not get paid, that comes back on the seller, not the buyer. But you now own the property. People love subject to the mortgage. I do as well. You just got to be super careful how you deal with it, because there are potential issues that can come back to you down the road that you didn't want, you didn't expect, and you really shouldn't have to deal with, unless, of course, you stop making payments on the debt.
Yeah, and one thing we always mentioned on our podcast is that you don't want to, for the long term, you don't want to just wholesale it. And I mean, because if your buyer falls through on payments down the road, then that's where you can get into trouble. Or long term, if the seller wants to get another house, buy another house at some point, that can be an issue as well.
And we'll talk a little more in depth about that in just a minute.
Okay.
But subject to, again, you are actually receiving the deed. So title is transferring. The debt is staying in the seller's name, and you then have some agreement that you will continue to make those payments for whatever term that you decide into the future.
Right.
And we'll talk about some good and bad with some of these, but let's talk about how the all-inclusive and the wraparound work.
Okay.
So Jonathan, if you had a house that you're selling to me for $100,000, you owe 50 on it, and I offer you $80,000, and I'm going to give you $10,000 down. I want you to have a note for $70,000. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm going to create terms on that note. And one of the things that I need to know is, hey, what are the terms on your underlying note? Because really wouldn't be worthwhile for me to make terms that don't at least match or exceed your terms on your underlying note.
Right.
And when I say that, interest rate doesn't have to be the same, but the monthly payment needs to be at least as much as what you're paying. I don't really want you coming out of pocket every month to cover your mortgage.
Yeah, there can't be a deficiency.
Yeah. And if my interest rate is not the same, if it's significantly less, I don't want to drag it out so long that my principal balance will eventually catch up to your principal balance and exceed it. And when I say exceed it, it will be less than your balance. So, hey, some point in the future, you may have to come to the closing table with money to sell the property.
Right.
So those are some of the things that you need to be aware of. But what we're doing is creating a new note, and we're wrapping that around that. So in essence, if I now own your property, you've sold it to me, title has transferred when we do this kind of deal, all-inclusive or wraparound. I am now on title. I now pay, and I would always recommend this, set up a third-party escrow service anytime that there is an underlying loan. Mm-hmm. I will make my payment to the escrow service. They will then make the payment to the bank, the underlying loan. Whatever is left over, they will send to the seller. They will also, if escrow needs to be set up for taxes and insurance, they can set that up. If it's already in your loan, your underlying loan, they will pay that payment to the bank, and the bank will separate that out, taxes and insurance. And that's how the wrap or the all-inclusive work. So keep this in mind. And let's go back really quick. So lease option, we know that every loan that's made at all, really, unless it's an owner finance loan, any kind of conventional loan, has a due on sale clause in it. And that due on sale clause means that if I transfer ownership of my property, the bank has a due on sale clause that means that they have the right to call that loan due if you don't pay them off. One of the misnomers out there is that it's not illegal to do all of this, but you need to be aware that the bank has that right. Now, should that worry you? Not really. I've been doing this 19 years. I've had one loan, wasn't even called due, but they made me assume it, but they did it without any qualifying, so I didn't really care. And to be honest, if I had to do it all over again, I probably just wouldn't even respond to them. As long as they continue to collect payments, they can't call the loan due. They would literally have to stop taking payments and take this performing asset and make it a non-performing asset. But as a lease option, you don't technically violate any due on sale clause.
Right.
As a subject to, you are absolutely violating the due on sale clause.
Yeah.
Trust deed and note and mortgage, you're not, because there's no loan. All inclusive and wraparound, you are. You are violating. Title has transferred to someone else. You have not paid off the bank. You are violating the due on sale clause. So I wanted to make that clear. That some of these, the reason why you need to know how some of them work is because, hey, sellers are going to have some questions. You need to know what the possible consequences are. You need to understand when to use what in what situation.
Right.
Okay, so was I clear enough on wrap and all inclusive?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So now let's deal with the last category, which is contract for deed, land contract. Those are probably the two most popular names, but there's agreement for deed. It might even be bond for deed. I mean, there's a number of different terms out there that basically mean all the same thing. And it works exactly like the trust deed and note or the all-inclusive trust deed and note, except for one major difference, and that is title does not transfer.
Right.
So the seller remains on title. You have what's called an equitable interest in the property. You are the owner. You are allowed to do what you want with the property. And we've used this example a number of times, but it's exactly like buying a car. When you go to the car dealership and you pick out a car, you fill out the paperwork, you get financing, you leave with that car belongs to you. You own the car. However, you don't have title to the car. Title remains with the bank.
Right.
You sell that car or you pay it off, you then get the title. Now, you wouldn't get the title if you sold it, but title would go to someone else. Same exact thing here. So as contract for deed, land contract, and all the other terms out there, no title will transfer. So technically, and I say technically because there is a lot of gray area here, but technically you do not violate the due on sale clause. Could the bank still make a case? They could, but they're probably not going to win. They're probably going to give up before it ever became an issue. But that's why it's sometimes nice to use these types of strategies, because if you have a seller that's really worried about the due on sale clause, you can almost eliminate it either using a lease option or a contract for deed land contract kind of strategy.
Right. And one thing here, Jeff, that in our market there is a known bank that we know of here in Utah that notoriously calls loans due if they know that title has transferred. So anytime we see one of those loans on title, this is a strategy that we would prefer to use over doing an all-inclusive.
Yeah. And we've done episodes. I know that we interviewed Jeff Braylio at one point. We talked about trust, a way of kind of disguising any kind of transfer. And there's a number of different ways to help protect yourself. We've talked about leaving insurance in place so that you're not sending a red flag to a mortgage company. And so go back and listen to some previous episodes if you want to know. Hey, there are always ways to protect yourself, doing it whichever strategy you choose. But keep in mind that if you offer contract for deed, it's almost like a hybrid between a lease option and an all-inclusive or a trust deed and note. It's kind of like in the middle, because it's a little more than renting it. You're not renting it, you're selling and you're buying, but at the same time the seller's remaining on title. So
right.
To me, it's a little easier sell to the seller. And one of the other things, and this again is dependent upon your market, that by using some of these contract for deed or land contracts, and we should talk about this, is one of the key reasons why you would use one over the other is how does your state or the state that you're working in handle default? And
Right.
in Utah, we have a 4-month basically foreclosure process. So if we do a trust deed and note or mortgage, we wouldn't do a mortgage, but depending on where you are, you're looking at a foreclosure process. So if you're in somewhere like Utah and it's 4 months, you should know that, hey, it's going to be a minimum of 4 months to get the property back in case of a default. In some areas they have redemption periods, which can last up to a year. And so those might not be places where you want to use owner finance. You might want to use something a little different. And it might be contract for deed, or it might be land contract, or it might be a lease option. But you want to know what the default process is and how long of a period, and that will help dictate a lot more of what you're trying to accomplish. Lease option, there is no foreclosure, it's an eviction. Contract for deed and land contract may have some benefits, and that would be is that in Utah, at least, we have a forfeiture process where you can get the property back in about half the amount of time as a foreclosure, 30 to 60 days, which is more like an eviction here.
Yeah.
And if you have that in your area, that might be something that you want to look at. You also may want to look at, hey, am I buying this property? Because if I'm buying it, I'd prefer to have title. Having title is the strongest position. So if I'm buying it, I may want to be on title. So I'd probably look at doing, I'd rather do a wraparound or an all-inclusive or a trust deed or a mortgage. So I'm on title, even a subject to. If I'm wholesaling or I'm going to stay in the middle or something else, I want my buyer for sure to be on a lease option or land contract or contract for deed, because, hey, if they default, I want to be able to get the property back in the quickest way possible and not have to wait 4+ months and continue to make payments during those 4 months where I'm not receiving any income.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the advice is talk to your local real estate attorney in your area, and
as well.
Yeah, and talk to your accountant if you need that kind of counsel. But you got to find out what that is in your state. Jeff, we're kind of right at time here. Do you want to keep going on this, or you want to cut it?
No, I think really what the whole goal of this is to make our listeners think a little bit about what process they're trying to, what they're trying to accomplish.
Right.
What the default process is, and what's best for all the people involved. And so I wanted to just be clear. I've gotten a lot of questions and a lot of confusion about when to use what. So I just thought it would be a good idea that we kind of try to straighten that out. And if there's specific questions, call in. Yeah, let's deal with them so you're not out there in total confusion. But these are the main types of strategies that are used regularly throughout the country. And you've got to understand which ones are, one, going to work best in the market you're working in, what's going to work best for you, for the seller, for a potential buyer, and what the different consequences are with them.
Love it. Love it. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing that knowledge. And we've kind of gotten, a little deep into the weeds here, but we've always told our listeners, if you don't understand what we're talking about with our podcast, you should go back and just start from the beginning, because that's the best way you're going to learn it and comprehend it. And
I really think that's the issue. Is I think a lot of people, when they get introduced to the podcast, they start at the latest. And our podcast is a little different. It's more a little instructional. You got to start at the beginning. That's where we talk about the different strategies, the pros, the cons, the whatever.
Yeah, our podcast is a master class on creative financing. and it's very instructional. It's not, hopefully it's a little entertaining, but I don't know. But it's kind of what differentiates us, Jeff, from some of the other podcasts out there. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for listening. We greatly appreciate your ear. We encourage you to pass this on to anyone you may know that is dabbling in real estate or is wholesaling or flipping houses, because anyone who invests in real estate can benefit from this information. Guys, you can reach us on our hotline with specific questions at 877-409-8090. Again, 877-409-8090. You can leave us a comment there. If you have any questions, please give us a ring, because we would really like this show to be more of a show around answering your guys' questions about creative financing. So give us a call there. You can also reach us on the web at www.thecreativefinancingpodcast.com. That's where all of our episodes are. And we're on Facebook, The Creative Financing Podcast there. And we also have a YouTube channel, The Creative Financing Show. So when we do these videos, we're uploading it to YouTube. So you can find us all those places. So we're kind of out there now. Any last words, Jeff?
Just a couple of things. One is that we're working on some pretty cool things that will start figuring out ways to get out there. Videos of me working through calculations and how to put together offers on particular deals. And I do have an apprentice program. Actually have 2 apprentice programs. Pretty much easy to work with. Just contact us and I'll tell you all about it. But looking for people all over the country. 1, instructional, 2, just kind of a way to JV, but we'll give you all the information. Just call into the hotline, leave me your name and number, and I'll get back with you.
Perfect, guys. Until next time, create some terms.